The sound of motorcycle engines filled the night air as a gang of bikers roared into the quiet town. The vibrations of their loud engines shook the nearby houses, their tires kicking up dust as they sped through the main street. Among the bikers, a figure stood out, a tall man in a leather jacket, tattoos running down his arms, his face a hardened mask of indifference. His name was Jake, the leader of the group. Behind him were 5 others, their faces grim as they followed his lead. They were looking for trouble, and trouble was exactly what they found. Harold Hawk Edwards, a 90-year-old black veteran, had been living alone in his modest home for years. The world had changed around him, but he remained rooted in the quiet pride of his past service. A hero, or so he thought, in a country that had never fully appreciated his sacrifices. The memories of the war, the camaraderie, and the injustice he endured were all locked away, hidden deep inside him. But tonight, all those memories came rushing back, not as the triumphs of a soldier, but as the cruel reminder of what it had cost him. Jake and his crew pulled up in front of Harold's house, their bikes screeching to a halt. Harold, sitting on his porch with a weathered cane beside him, looked up from his thoughts. His eyes, though aged, were still sharp. He could feel the danger before it even arrived. The bikers dismounted and surrounded him, their sneers and mocking laughter filling the air. Jake was the first to speak, his voice a harsh, guttural tone. "You're out here all alone, old man. It's a shame to see someone like you still breathing, still standing tall. Maybe we'll fix that." Harold didn't flinch. His hands gripped his cane tighter as he stood slowly, rising to face them. "I fought for this country. I fought for people like you to have the freedom to be idiots. You should be grateful." Jake stepped forward, his face a mask of disdain. "Grateful? You fought for a country that didn't even give a damn about you. What's a guy like you even doing here, thinking you matter?" Harold's heart skipped a beat, his blood boiling at the reminder of the injustices he'd endured, the prejudice he'd fought through during his time in the military. But he remained calm. "You know nothing about me, boy. I've seen more than you ever will." The bikers closed in, shoving him back onto the porch. Without warning, one of them delivered a punch to Harold's gut, knocking the wind out of him. Another kicked his legs from beneath him, sending him crashing to the ground. The group of bikers laughed as they watched him struggle to regain his composure. "Is this your hero?" Jake sneered. "I think it's time for the old man to finally realize he's got nothing left." Harold lay there, bruised and gasping for air, but even in that moment, there was something in his eyes. Something they couldn't see but felt all the same, a history of strength, resilience, and the kind of pride that couldn't be crushed. The bikers didn't care. They took turns kicking and pushing him, each blow a testament to their hatred and their belief that they were untouchable. But Harold remained silent, taking it all, his body breaking under the weight of years and the sheer force of their violence. He refused to beg, refused to show weakness. Finally, Jake stepped back, wiping his hands on his jacket. "That should be enough," he said, nodding to his crew. As the bikers mounted their bikes and sped away into the night, the oppressive silence of the street returned. But Harold didn't get up immediately. He stayed on the ground, his mind racing. The attack had not been just a random act of violence. It was an insult to everything he stood for, everything he had fought for. It was a reminder of the racial hatred that still thrived in corners of the world he had once believed had healed. But the world had changed, hadn't it? The bikers had left him for dead, but they hadn't broken him. And he knew deep down that this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning of something much bigger. As Harold finally managed to get to his feet, his gaze shifted toward the stars above, distant and cold. He wasn't alone. Not really. At that very moment, his son, Jalen, a man of considerable power in his own right, stood across town, feeling the disturbance in the air. He had always known that his father's struggles were far from over, but he hadn't anticipated the brutal reminder of the world's hatred. The connection between father and son was deeper than blood, it was ancestral. Jalen had felt the old man's pain long before he'd received the call. Jalen's ability was more than just knowledge. It was rooted in the very fabric of his heritage. A practitioner of voodoo, he had inherited powers from a line of ancestors who had fought against oppression with both strength and magic. His father's past, his sacrifices, had been woven into the tapestry of his bloodline. And now, it was time to call upon that power. The world around Jalen seemed to shift as he began to chant under his breath. The wind picked up, a strange chill filling the air, though the night was still. The spirits of those who had come before him, the black soldiers who had fought in wars, who had faced injustice and survived, stirred. They responded to the call, their presence growing stronger with every syllable. Jalen didn't know exactly what would happen next. He didn't need to. He had made a promise to his father, a promise to right the wrongs done to him. And he would see it through. In the distance, as Jake and his crew sped away from Harold's home, they had no idea that their actions had set something far more dangerous in motion. Their fun had been cruel, their mocking laughter had filled the air, but they had no idea of the forces they had disturbed. The air around them seemed to thicken, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the ground. Jake felt the change before anyone else, a creeping sensation of unease that seemed to crawl under his skin. They couldn't know it, but their lives were about to become a nightmare of their own making. The spirits of the past, led by the soul of a man who had once fought for this very country, were coming for them. And they were not going to leave until they had delivered justice. As the bikers sped off into the night, the streets fell silent once more. The wind carried the dust, and the quiet hum of the town returned, seemingly unaffected by the violence that had just transpired. But for Jake and his crew, the world had already begun to change. They didn't feel it at first. They were used to the thrill of their reckless behavior, accustomed to intimidating anyone who crossed their path. They'd left the old man broken, humiliated, and they were proud of it. But as they traveled further down the road, the atmosphere began to shift. The temperature seemed to drop, a strange chill settling over them. It wasn't just the cool night air, it was something else. Jake was the first to notice the shift. His knuckles tightened on the handlebars, a sudden unease crawling up his spine. His usually steady hands began to tremble. He looked around, trying to shake the feeling off, but it was there, gnawing at him. He glanced back at his crew, but they were all still laughing, oblivious to the dark change that had started creeping in. It was then that the first vision hit. Jake's eyes went wide as the road in front of him seemed to distort, the asphalt rippling like a mirage. The colors around him bled, turning into a sickly green hue. He blinked hard, but the vision remained. The scene in front of him twisted into something from a forgotten past, a battlefield, littered with the bodies of soldiers, their faces contorted in pain and fear. And standing amidst them was a figure, a black soldier, his uniform torn and stained with blood. His eyes were cold, filled with an unspoken rage, his body covered in scars, his mouth twisted into a silent scream of vengeance. Jake jerked his bike to the side, nearly losing control. His crew didn't notice, lost in their own world, still oblivious to the growing tension. But Jake couldn't shake the image from his mind. The vision lingered, haunting him, even as the road returned to its normal, empty state. "Jake, you all right?" One of his men, Mike, shouted over the roar of the engines. I don't know," Jake muttered, his voice shaky. "Something's wrong. I saw something. A soldier. It looked like something from the past." Mike laughed it off, slapping him on the back. "You're just tired, man. We all are. Let's just get back to the club and forget about it." But Jake couldn't forget. The image, that face, haunted him. It felt real, like the soldier was right there, looking him in the eyes, demanding something from him. The ride grew longer, and the strange occurrences intensified. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, felt wrong. Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened, and his heart began to race. The voices in his head grew louder, a chorus of whispers, demanding answers, justice, and, most terrifying of all, revenge. Then it happened again. Another vision. This time, it wasn't just one soldier, it was dozens, maybe hundreds, all appearing in the blink of an eye. They were everywhere, surrounding the bikers, their faces a mix of anger and sorrow. They stood tall and proud, but their eyes were empty, void of life, filled only with the memory of pain and suffering. The soldiers moved in unison, their footsteps silent, as if they were walking through a fog. Jake slammed on the brakes, the bike screeching to a halt. His crew followed suit, pulling over to the side of the road. The atmosphere had thickened. The air felt heavier now, laden with the scent of old earth and death. It was as if the world around them had shifted, turned into something darker, something ancient. "Mike! You see this?" Jake's voice was almost a whisper, filled with dread. Mike squinted into the night, trying to see what Jake was seeing. But there was nothing there, not physically. The road was still empty, the only sounds were the distant hum of engines. "What the hell, Jake? You need to stop freaking out." But Jake wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the space in front of him, his breath shallow as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It was then that the whispers turned into words, their voices coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You cannot escape us. You cannot outrun what you have done. You must pay for your sins." The words echoed in his mind, and he stumbled off his bike, falling to his knees. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. His vision blurred, but the voices persisted, rising louder, growing more urgent. Who are you?" Jake gasped, his voice shaking as he struggled to stand. "We are the Forgotten," the voice answered, cold and heavy. "We are the souls of those you've wronged. You will feel our pain. You will experience our suffering." The other bikers started to notice now the way Jake was trembling, his eyes wide with terror. They didn't understand, not yet. But they could feel it too, the shift, the wrongness in the air. The temperature had plummeted, the night around them suffocating, thick with a presence that none of them could explain. Mike looked at Jake, his face twisted in confusion and concern. "Jake, man, what the hell is going on? What did you see?" But Jake couldn't answer. The visions had consumed him completely. The soldiers were there again, surrounding him, their cold eyes boring into him. Each one was a reminder of a dark history, a history that Jake and his crew had ignored, dismissed, and disrespected. Jake's body shook as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, his mind unraveling as the spirits forced him to relive the horrors that they had experienced. The injustice, the prejudice, the brutality of a time he had never known, but now had to live through. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the vision stopped. The air cleared, and the temperature rose back to normal. The spirits were gone. But the damage was done. Jake slowly rose to his feet, his body drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The world around him was quiet once again, but the terror lingered, an unshakable weight in the pit of his stomach. His hands were trembling, his mind reeling. He looked at his crew, but they were just as lost as he was. They hadn't seen what he had seen. They didn't understand. But they would. Jake knew deep down that they would never be the same. The spirits had marked them. The weight of their actions was now etched into their souls, and there was no escaping it. The question wasn't whether they could outrun their past. It was whether they could find redemption in a future that was now tainted by the ghosts of the soldiers they had wronged. The following morning, the aftermath of the previous night's terror hung over them like a dark cloud. Jake couldn't shake the sense that something had changed forever. He tried to go through the motions of a normal day, but every movement felt slow, mechanical, as if his body wasn't fully connected to his mind. The voices from the night before echoed in his head, relentless, urging him to pay attention, urging him to understand the significance of what had happened. But Jake was far from ready to confront it. He wasn't sure what was real anymore, whether it was the voices, the soldiers, or the haunting feeling of guilt that had taken root in his chest. He tried to dismiss it all, but deep down, he knew he couldn't. He needed to talk to his crew. They were all in this together, even if they hadn't seen what he had seen. They needed to know the truth, whether they believed it or not. He found the others at their usual hangout, a dilapidated building on the edge of town. The place smelled of stale beer and gasoline, a permanent scent that clung to everything. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could forget the world and just be who they were, violent, unapologetic, and free. But as Jake walked through the door, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The others didn't greet him with their usual boisterousness. There was a tense silence in the room. The air felt thick, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Mike was the first to speak, his voice low and cautious. "Jake, what the hell happened last night? You went completely off the rails. You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, looking at his crew, wondering how much they could truly understand. "You guys didn't see it, did you?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "See what?" Mike pressed, crossing his arms. "All I saw was you losing your mind for no reason. What the hell is going on?" Jake's hands shook as he tried to steady his breath. "The soldier. The one from last night. He's real. All of them are." Mike laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Jake, you need to calm down. You're freaking us all out." "No," Jake shot back, his voice sharp. "It's not just in my head. It's real. The soldiers, the ones who suffered, it's like they're inside me now. And they're not going anywhere." The room fell into a heavy silence. No one spoke for a long moment. It was as if they were all waiting for Jake to snap out of it, to explain it away, to tell them it was just a bad trip or a dream. But Jake couldn't explain it away. He wasn't imagining things. He could feel their eyes on him, some skeptical, others worried, but all of them unsure of what to make of it. He wasn't sure what to make of it either, but he knew one thing for certain: they had messed with forces beyond their comprehension. "What the hell does that mean, man?" Mike asked, breaking the silence. "You're saying we pissed off some ghosts or something?" Jake took a deep breath. He was done denying it, done pretending it wasn't real. "Yeah. That's exactly what I'm saying. We're being haunted. We're being forced to relive the pain, the suffering. And if we don't get right with it, if we don't fix what we've done, we're not going to make it out of this alive." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for the first time, Jake saw the fear in his crew's eyes. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't mocking him. They were scared. "You seriously believe that?" Mike asked, his voice quieter now. "That we're being hunted by, what? Ghosts of soldiers? Hell, man, I don't know what's happening, but I know we can't go around thinking we've pissed off the dead." Jake nodded grimly. "You can think whatever you want, but I know what I felt. I know what I saw. And it's not going to go away. We have to do something about it." "Like what?" Mike asked, clearly skeptical. "What are we supposed to do? Go apologize to some ghosts?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "It's not just about apologizing. It's about doing what's right. It's about acknowledging the suffering we've caused and doing something to make up for it. We have to fix this." "You want us to make amends?" Mike scoffed. "We're bikers, Jake. We don't apologize. We don't make amends." Jake stood firm, his body tense. "We have to now. The ghosts won't leave us alone until we do. You can keep running from it, but it's not going to go away." There was a long pause, and then, for the first time, someone else spoke up. It was Rick, the quietest member of the crew. He was the one who usually stayed in the background, letting the others take the lead, but now he was looking at Jake with a new kind of intensity. "You're right," Rick said, his voice steady but filled with a hint of uncertainty. "Maybe we don't understand it, but something's wrong. And maybe we do need to fix it." Jake's eyes widened slightly. It wasn't what he had expected, but in that moment it gave him hope. If Rick could see it, maybe the rest of the crew could too. "So, what now?" Mike asked, still hesitant. Jake paused, considering the question. "Now we find out what we need to do to make it right. We find the truth behind the soldiers, behind what they went through. We learn from it. You think we can just walk away from the crap we've done?" Mike asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "You really think it's that simple?" Jake's expression hardened. "No, I don't think it's going to be easy. But we can't keep running. If we want to survive, if we want redemption, we have to face it. We have to learn from the past, and we have to change. The room grew quiet again, but this time, there was something different in the air. It wasn't just tension, it was something else, something heavier. Jake could see the uncertainty in their eyes, but there was also a glimmer of something else. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was hope. But either way, they all knew one thing: they had to make a choice. They could keep running from their past, from the ghosts that haunted them, or they could face it head on and find redemption. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about changing. The following days were marked by unease, as the bikers navigated the aftermath of their violent encounter. Jake's words weighed heavily on them all, lingering in the background of their lives. Despite their efforts to push the eerie events of that night aside, there was an undeniable shift in the air, a growing sense of something that couldn't be ignored. Each member of the crew felt it, whether in the pit of their stomachs or as a shadow lingering just out of sight. Jake could see it clearly now, as though a fog had lifted from his mind. The ghosts weren't just haunting him, they were haunting them all. The tension was palpable, an ever-present force that loomed over their daily lives. It was no longer a matter of just surviving or pretending the world hadn't changed. The voices had become louder, more insistent, and they seemed to be calling him, demanding action. He couldn't shake the images of the soldiers he had seen in his mind, their faces twisted in pain, their eyes filled with anger and regret. They were trapped in his head, as if he had become a conduit for their suffering. But it wasn't just the soldiers. It was the weight of the history they carried, the injustice, the inequality, the horrors they had experienced. It was something Jake could no longer ignore. It wasn't just a matter of redemption anymore. It was about understanding the depth of the pain they had caused, the damage they had perpetuated. The bikers had lived their lives with no real understanding of the oppression that others had faced. Now, in the face of this supernatural reckoning, they were being forced to reckon with the darkness they had allowed to fester. The price for their past actions was becoming clear, and the cost was high. One evening, Jake couldn't take it any longer. He gathered the crew at the abandoned building once again, his mind set on finally confronting what had been plaguing him. They needed to face the truth of their situation. They needed to understand what the spirits were demanding of them, what price they had to pay. "We need to do something about this," Jake said, his voice firm and resolute. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to pass. These spirits, they want us to learn, to make it right. And if we don't, it's not just our lives that are at stake, it's everyone we come into contact with." There was a brief silence as the crew absorbed Jake's words. It was clear that some of them were still skeptical, but there was also a glimmer of fear in their eyes. They couldn't deny that something had changed. Something was pushing them toward a reckoning, and they couldn't outrun it. "You're talking about redemption," Mike said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But you think we can just wipe away everything we've done? All the pain, all the hate?" Jake met his gaze, unwavering. "No, it won't be easy. It won't be quick. But we don't have a choice anymore. We either face it or we perish." Rick, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "What exactly do you think we need to do? What does making it right even look like?" Jake took a deep breath, his mind working through the possibilities. "It starts with understanding what we've done. We need to learn about the suffering that those soldiers endured. We need to see the world through their eyes, feel the pain they felt. Only then can we begin to understand the depth of our wrongs." Mike scoffed. "So, you want us to learn about the past, like we can somehow change it?" "No," Jake said firmly. "But we can understand it. And by understanding it, we can change how we move forward. We can change the way we interact with the world, the way we treat people." The room fell silent again as Jake's words sunk in. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow. For years, they had built their lives on a foundation of anger and violence, fueled by a sense of superiority and entitlement. The idea of change was foreign to them, and yet, deep down, they all knew that something had to shift. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "So, what's the plan? How do we learn all this stuff?" Jake looked at him with a determined expression. We start by finding out about the soldiers. We dig into their stories, their experiences. We talk to people who lived through it, who can tell us what it was really like. Where do we even start with that? Rick asked, his voice hesitant. How do we find these people? We'll go to the source, Jake replied. We'll go to the veterans, the ones who fought alongside those soldiers. We'll ask them about the horrors they witnessed, the struggles they endured. We'll listen to their stories, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Mike shook his head. You think they'll just tell us everything? You think they'll be willing to help us? We don't have a choice, Jake said. We have to make ourselves vulnerable. We have to confront the past and own up to the things we've done. That's the only way we're going to get through this. The crew exchanged uncertain looks, but something in Jake's tone made them pause. He wasn't asking for their approval anymore. He was demanding action. They couldn't keep running from the truth. The ghosts wouldn't let them. The reckoning was coming, and they had no choice but to face it. We'll start tomorrow, Jake continued, his voice steady. We'll find the veterans. We'll listen to their stories. And we'll begin to understand what it truly means to carry the weight of history. The crew nodded slowly, the decision made. It wouldn't be easy, but they had no other option. They had to face the truth of their actions, no matter how uncomfortable or painful it was. They had to learn from the past if they wanted any hope of redemption. Jake felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in days, he felt like he was on the right path. The ghosts might still be haunting him, but now, he had a plan. He had a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. The crew gathered their things, ready to face the difficult journey ahead. They didn't know what they would find when they sought out the veterans, but they knew that whatever it was, it would be the key to their redemption. The road ahead would be long and painful, but it was the only way forward. Jake and the crew spent the following days tracking down veterans from the era, scouring old records and visiting military institutions, searching for any information that could help them understand the depth of the history they had so recklessly ignored. The more they learned, the heavier the burden became. Stories of brutality, of black soldiers enduring segregated units, of unimaginable hardships in combat, began to form a tapestry of pain, resentment, and unimaginable strength. It was like peeling back layers of a history they had been taught to overlook, and with each layer, the weight on their hearts grew heavier. The veterans they met were not easy to approach. Many had long since shut themselves off from the world, hardened by years of suffering and indifference. Others wore their scars openly, their wounds not just physical but emotional, searing reminders of what they had endured. Jake and his crew had to earn their trust. They had to show they were sincere, willing to learn from their past mistakes. They had to prove that they were not just another set of ignorant men trying to make up for their wrongs with empty words. The first real breakthrough came when they met a former sergeant, now in his late 70s, who had served in the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the first black units to fight in World War II. His name was Charles, and his hands shook when he spoke of the atrocities he had witnessed. He told them about the relentless racism he faced within his own ranks, about the constant threat of death both from the enemy and from his supposed allies. His eyes darkened as he recounted the prejudice he and his fellow soldiers endured, even after they had proven themselves on the battlefield. "You want to understand what your people did?" Charles said one afternoon, his voice rough and bitter. "It's not just about what they did to us in combat. It's about the life we lived after the war. We fought for this country, for its freedoms, and came back to nothing. No respect. No recognition. Just a bunch of bitter old white men who thought they could tell us we were less than them. That we didn't deserve what we earned." Jake felt the weight of those words hit him like a freight train. He had no answer. There was nothing he could say to justify the atrocities his crew had perpetuated. He only nodded, feeling small in the face of such deep-seated hurt. He had to understand this pain. He had to make his crew understand it too. Over the next few days, they listened to more stories, some filled with anger, others with resignation, but all marked by a painful truth that they had been oblivious to for far too long. The ghosts that haunted Jake were not just the spirits of soldiers lost in battle. They were the ghosts of a society that had turned its back on those who had fought for it. And it was clear now that those spirits were demanding that he and his crew pay attention, that they make amends for the years of ignorance and disdain they had shown toward those who had been their equals all along. The deeper they went into this history, the more Jake saw the real challenge ahead. It wasn't just about learning from the past, it was about confronting their own prejudices, the deep-rooted racism that had been passed down from generation to generation, from the bikers' very own families and communities. They had all grown up with these views ingrained in them, taught by a society that had told them that white was superior, that their lives were worth more, that those who were different didn't deserve the same respect. But now, the walls that had protected them for so long were crumbling. The ghosts of the past were no longer distant. They were right here, in the present, in their minds, in their souls. They had to confront these spirits head-on and change the way they saw the world. It was a long, hard road, but it was the only one that would lead them to redemption. Mike, who had been the most resistant at first, was starting to crack. The stories they had heard from the veterans had hit him harder than he'd expected. He began to ask more questions, to dig deeper into the history of the men who had fought for their country but had never received the recognition they deserved. It was as if a light had been switched on in his mind, and the more he learned, the more he realized just how blind he had been. It was a painful realization, one that made him feel guilty and ashamed, but it was also the first step towards something better. By the time they visited the National Museum of African American History and Culture, they were no longer just learning, they were becoming advocates. They began to understand that their role was no longer one of just seeking redemption for their actions, but to also ensure that the stories of these veterans, these soldiers, would not be forgotten. They had to carry that torch forward. They had to fight for the recognition these men had been denied for so long. The museum itself was a visceral experience. The artifacts, the photographs, the personal items of soldiers who had fought through unimaginable hardship, it all hit them like a wave. They stood before a display of letters written by black soldiers to their families, letters that detailed the hell they lived through, the discrimination they faced even on the front lines. One letter, in particular, was scrawled by a young soldier, only a few years older than Jake, detailing how his platoon had been attacked by the enemy, and how the only thing that saved them was the courage of the black soldiers who had been relegated to the back ranks. The letter ended with a line that would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. "We are not less than them. We are just as good." In that moment, Jake understood. He understood that the spirits weren't just seeking vengeance, they were seeking justice. They weren't just punishing the bikers for their actions, they were holding them accountable for the history they had ignored. They were demanding that they recognize the worth of those who had been oppressed, that they fight for the equality that had been denied to so many. It was clear now that the redemption the spirits spoke of was not something that could be earned overnight. It wasn't just about making amends for past wrongs. It was about changing the way they lived, changing their understanding of what it meant to be human, to be part of a society that was flawed but capable of transformation. It was about fighting for the future, for a world where no one had to live with the weight of racism, discrimination, and hatred. And so, they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their path forward would be long, painful, and difficult. But it was a path they had to walk, not just for themselves, but for the generations that had come before them, and for those who would come after. As Jake and the crew continued their journey through this painful history, they started to face the consequences of their own actions. The visions had become more intense. At night the dreams would come, vivid and relentless, pulling them deeper into the horrors the spirits had witnessed. These were not the typical nightmares of guilt or fear that plagued them at first. No, these were visceral, real-time experiences of what it meant to be oppressed, to fight for a country that treated you as less than human, and to endure that treatment while doing the very things that others could never have imagined. Mike, who had been the hardest to reach, now found himself haunted by images of black soldiers, their faces twisted in anguish, their bodies broken by the same hatred that had driven the bikers to attack the veteran. He woke up in cold sweats, his breath shallow, his heart racing. It wasn't just the fear of the spirits anymore. It was the realization of how much he had to change, how deep the wounds were, and how far they needed to go to heal. The weight of it all began to push him to the brink. He wasn't sure if he could make it through this, if he could truly leave behind everything he had been taught, everything that had shaped his identity. But he wasn't alone. The crew was changing together, in small but significant ways. They had started attending community events, some led by local black leaders who were striving to make a difference in the face of decades of neglect. These leaders were patient with the bikers, but they weren't forgiving. They made it clear that respect had to be earned, not given, and that no amount of good intentions could undo the harm done by generations of racism and injustice. At first, Jake had tried to argue, to explain that they were doing their best to learn. But each conversation ended with the same cold truth: actions spoke louder than words, and their past actions had spoken volumes. Still, they persisted. They didn't give up, despite the weight of history pressing on them. They showed up, they listened, they acknowledged the pain of the community they had once tried to dominate. The more they listened, the more they understood that the ghosts that haunted them weren't just part of some punishment. They were a call to action, a demand for accountability, a demand for real change. The bikers had to prove that they were not just passive participants in the world they had created. They had to actively seek redemption. The first real test of their resolve came when they were invited to speak at a community meeting in the heart of the city. The group, a coalition of local black families and activists, had heard about their efforts to learn from the past and had agreed to give them a platform. It was a test they were not prepared for. They had thought that they were ready to speak, ready to explain why they were seeking redemption. But when they stood before the community, the weight of the moment crushed them. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble, always been able to spin a story, but this was different. There were no excuses here. There was only the truth, and that truth was ugly. He stumbled, faltering for a moment, before taking a deep breath. I've made mistakes. We all have. And I know that nothing we do will take back what we've done. But I'm here to listen, to learn, and to make things right. The silence that followed was deafening. The community sat there, watching them, waiting. Mike, standing beside Jake, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure what to say either. All his life, he had been taught that people like him were entitled to respect, that they were owed something because of who they were. But this wasn't about entitlement. It was about humility. It was about earning respect, not demanding it. Finally, a woman stood from the back of the room. She was tall, dignified, her eyes sharp and steady as she looked them over. She was a descendant of one of the veterans they had been learning about, the ones whose stories had haunted them during the nights of torment. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight. You want to make things right? She asked, her gaze piercing. Then you need to do more than show up. You need to change your lives. You need to protect our communities. You need to fight for us, just like those soldiers fought for your freedom. Not with words. With actions. With real sacrifice. The room was still. Every eye was on them, and Jake could feel the intensity of their gaze, like they were weighing every word they had said and would say. He nodded, realizing that this was the moment of truth. The moment when they had to prove their sincerity. This wasn't about some half-baked apology. It was about doing the work, about stepping into the trenches and fighting not just for themselves but for the people they had once wronged. The journey was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. But for the first time since the attack on the veteran, Jake felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about the community, about the legacy of those who had fought for a freedom they had never been allowed to enjoy fully. It was about honoring that struggle, about ensuring that it was never forgotten. The spirits that had tormented them were still present, their vengeance not yet fully realized. But they were no longer a threat. They had become a force for change, a reminder that redemption could only be earned through action, through real, sustained effort. The bikers had taken the first step. Now, they had to keep moving forward, even when it felt like the weight of the world was pushing them back. As the meeting ended, Jake and Mike walked out into the cold night air. They had a long road ahead of them, and they didn't know where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, they felt that maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. The days that followed the meeting were filled with a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that comes with the weight of responsibility. Jake and his crew were no longer just men seeking redemption, they had become part of something much larger. The change they had started to embrace was not merely about their own guilt, but about the systems of injustice they had perpetuated, knowingly or unknowingly. Each day, they continued their efforts to engage with the communities they had once feared or disregarded, but the process was far from smooth. At first, it seemed like their presence was only tolerated, at best. People were wary of them, their history as bikers too recent to ignore. They had to prove themselves, not through speeches, not through apologies, but through small, consistent actions that spoke louder than any words they could muster. They volunteered at shelters, helped clean up neighborhoods, and began to mentor troubled youth, though it often felt like an uphill battle. Some of the kids were skeptical, understandably so, and the older residents of the community were even more so. Jake, who had always been the face of their group, struggled the most. He had been used to controlling situations, to dominating conversations and bending people to his will. But now, no amount of swagger could mask the distrust people had toward them. It wasn't just about making up for past mistakes. It was about being honest and vulnerable, two things Jake had never allowed himself to be. Each day, the crew faced the sharp stares, the quiet murmurs behind their backs, and the occasional challenge to prove their intentions. But it wasn't all resistance. There were moments of real connection. One afternoon, Jake and Mike found themselves talking to an elderly man who had lived through the civil rights movement. His stories were full of pain, but also of strength and resilience. He told them about his struggles as a young man, about the bridges he had to build to overcome the hatred that was woven into the very fabric of his community. "You're not here to fix anything in a day," he said to them. "You're here to start the journey. And that journey is long." It was that conversation that began to shift something in Jake. He realized that what they were doing wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't going to be wrapped up neatly with a bow at the end. There was no grand gesture that could erase the past. The community needed more than just surface-level change. They needed to see that Jake and the others were willing to stick around, to fight for the long haul, even when it was hard and uncomfortable. Mike, too, was beginning to change. His pride, which had been a barrier between him and the world around him, started to crack. He had spent most of his life believing that the world owed him respect, that his position as a biker meant something. But now, he was learning that respect had to be earned through service, through sacrifice. He started to understand the difference between what he thought he deserved and what he needed to give back. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't always know what to say, but he listened. And that, in itself, was a form of change. Yet, even as they worked to build bridges, the spirits that had been summoned to haunt them continued to test their resolve. Late at night, the crew would hear voices from the past, soldiers' voices, angry and vengeful, demanding that they pay the price for the harm they had caused. The spirits would take them back to places where black men had fought not just on the battlefield, but in the streets, in the homes, and in their own hearts. They were forced to relive moments of oppression, moments they could never fully understand but were now forced to witness. Every time they closed their eyes, the images flooded back, of soldiers marching in the scorching sun, of families torn apart by the systems that kept them down, of people who had died for a country that didn't care for them. These visions weren't just memories of the past. They were a reminder that change had to come with real sacrifice. The bikers could not simply offer apologies. They had to live through the pain they had caused, to feel it in their own bodies. Mike, who had been the most resistant, was now seeing what the spirits had meant when they demanded justice. He saw how the weight of discrimination and hatred had burdened generations of people. It was no longer just a matter of feeling sorry. It was about understanding that they had contributed to this ongoing cycle of pain and hatred. One night, Jake woke up in a cold sweat, his body shaking with the aftereffects of a particularly intense vision. He had seen the men who had been lynched, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies hanging lifeless in the streets. The spirits had made him experience the terror and helplessness that black families had faced for generations. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of their history. It was a burden that had been carried by so many, and it was something that couldn't be simply shrugged off. He lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, grappling with the realization that no amount of good intentions would be enough to undo the wrongs of the past. But that didn't mean he could give up. The spirits had made it clear that redemption was possible, but it would take time and relentless commitment. Jake knew that they had to keep pushing forward, even if they didn't have all the answers. The crew began to face the painful truth that their journey of redemption wasn't just about them. It was about the generations of people who had suffered under systems they had helped create. Each day brought new challenges, new tests of their resolve. There were days when they felt like they were getting nowhere, when the work seemed too hard, too overwhelming. But there were also moments of grace, moments when they realized that change was possible, even if it was slow and hard. The spirits had shown them what had been, but now it was up to them to decide what would come next. Would they continue to fight for a better future, or would they fall back into their old ways? The answer, they knew, would come through their actions. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being present and making a difference, no matter how small. And as long as they kept moving forward, as long as they kept listening, they would eventually find their way to redemption. But they were still far from done. Every step they took, every day they fought, brought them closer to a new understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. They were learning, slowly but surely, that true leadership came not from power, but from service. And it was only through that service that they could hope to make up for the harm they had caused. The final step in their journey came quietly, without the dramatic confrontations they had expected. Jake and the crew had fought long and hard to prove their worth, but as they stood before the community they had once terrorized, the real test was not in what they had done, but in who they had become. The spirits had haunted them, pushed them, and shown them the depths of the pain their actions had caused, but now, it was time for them to take full responsibility and demonstrate their growth. The once formidable bikers stood before the people they had hurt, not as men with power to impose, but as men with lessons learned. There were still those who looked at them with distrust, as if waiting for the inevitable moment when they would slip back into their old ways. But there were others who saw the transformation, the quiet humility that had come with months of hard work, of dedication, and of facing down the ghosts of their past. Jake knew that nothing could undo the damage of years of hate and violence, but he also understood that it wasn't about erasing the past, it was about taking the steps, no matter how small, to ensure a better future. This wasn't the moment of grand redemption they had hoped for, but it was a moment of real change. The community didn't need to forgive them immediately, and they didn't expect it. All they could offer now was their ongoing commitment to serve, to be a part of something larger than themselves. The bikers had finally earned a measure of trust, but it wasn't handed to them on a silver platter. They had worked for it, not through grand gestures, but through the little things, helping neighbors rebuild after a storm, volunteering their time, and offering support where it was needed. Every time they helped, they were proving their sincerity, showing that they were willing to keep going, even when the work seemed endless. They knew that true redemption wasn't something that could be attained overnight. It was something that had to be earned, piece by piece, moment by moment. And yet, even as they stood before the people they had wronged, there was still the undeniable presence of the spirits, the ancestors who had come to them in the darkest moments, urging them toward justice. Those spirits still lingered, but now they no longer demanded vengeance. They had guided the bikers, showing them the paths they needed to walk, and now they were waiting, silently, for their final step. The bikers had earned their place in the community, but they still had to prove their worth through continued action. It wasn't enough to simply make a change, it had to be a lasting one. The son of the veteran, the one who had called upon the spirits, was still with them, though in a different capacity. He no longer needed to force the bikers into submission. He had watched their transformation, and, though it had been painful, He knew that they had finally embraced their responsibility. His role, now, was to help guide them as they took the next step, to make sure they didn't lose sight of the lessons they had learned. The crew was no longer simply trying to atone for their past. They had become a symbol of what could be achieved when people were willing to change. They had learned the hard way that redemption wasn't given freely. It was earned through continued service, through humility, and through the courage to face what they had done. They weren't heroes, but they were better than they had been. They had learned the value of true leadership, not the kind that demanded respect, but the kind that earned it by listening, by acting, and by showing up when it mattered. But there was still work to be done. They knew that their actions would have to speak louder than their words, that the real test of their commitment would come in the years to follow. They couldn't afford to slip back into their old ways, to forget the lessons the spirits had taught them. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the legacy they would leave behind, the communities they had helped to rebuild, and the future they had worked to shape. As they stood there, at the crossroads of their redemption, they understood that this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. They had fought against their own demons, faced the consequences of their past, and come out on the other side stronger, but the road ahead was long. They would continue to serve, continue to help, and continue to prove that redemption was not a one-time event, but a lifetime commitment. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace that came from escaping the past, but the peace that came from knowing they had done what they could. The spirits, the veterans, the community, they had all been watching. But now, it was their turn to lead, to show that the lessons they had learned were more than just words. They were actions, and those actions would speak for them long after they were gone.